You know, it's funny how a country can feel like a person. America is not just a name on a map. It's a voice you've heard your whole life. In school books, on the radio, in stories your granddad told while sitting on the porch after dinner. But before there were flags or presidents, before there were anthems or slogans, there were people. People who walked through forests with no fences, across rivers with no bridges, under skies with no borders. This is not a fairy tale with princes and dragons. This is a long, winding memory of a place becoming itself. A memory that begins before anyone ever thought to call it America. And if you're still awake, I'll tell you what I know. Some things I've read in books. Some I saw on an old black and white television. Some things my father swore they were true, even when they sounded like tall tales. So, let's start there. Before the first page was written. Before America had a name. Let me take you back to a time long before the word America ever echoed across this land. Before maps, before colonies, before anyone from across the ocean dared dream of a new world, this continent was already old, full of stories, full of people. It's easy to forget that. When we say history of the United States, most folks start with ships and pilgrims. But no friend this land already had footsteps across it, long before Columbus ever got lost. You just have to lean in and listen closely. Somewhere around 15,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, people crossed from what we now call Siberia into what we now call Alaska, back when the sea between them was frozen over. A land bridge, they think. Cold, wide, unforgiving. And they walked. And they kept walking. And over generations they spread across forests, deserts, rivers, and plains. They weren't looking to found a nation. They were chasing food. They were following the herds, the seasons, the stars. But along the way, they built something bigger than a meal. They built homes, traditions, civilizations. You ever heard of Cahokia? Most folks haven't, but it was once the biggest city north of Mexico. Right there near modern-day St. Louis around the year 1100. Tens of thousands of people lived there. They built huge earthen mounds, some taller than a 10-story building. No stone, no wheel, no draft animals. Just human hands lifting soil day after day. Cahokia had neighborhoods, plazas, temples. It was a place of ceremony, trade, and mystery. And then, sometime in the 1300s, it was abandoned. Quietly. Like a breath exhaled. No one knows why for sure. And that's just one. There were the ancestral Puebloans out west carving homes into cliff sides in what we now call Colorado and New Mexico. They had roads, reservoirs, complex societies, and beautiful pottery. They watched the sky and built in rhythm with the sun and stars. And then they too vanished into time. The Iroquois, the Algonquian, the Cherokee, the Sioux, hundreds of nations each with their own languages, beliefs, and borders. They weren't wandering tribes. They were sovereign peoples. They governed, negotiated, allied, and fought just like any kingdom in Europe. It's strange, isn't it? How the old world thought of this place as wild, empty, and waiting. But it wasn't waiting. It was already living. Imagine standing on a bluff in what we now call North Dakota, watching the buffalo thunder past like dark waves across a grassy sea, or sitting by the fire in a coastal village in what's now Maine, listening to the elders tell how the stars came to be. This wasn't a silent land. It was singing. But the songs weren't written down. They were passed in stories, in dances, in the hush of firelight. So when the first European feet touched the shore, they didn't find silence. They just didn't know how to listen. And yes, not all was peace. There were wars between native nations, territory, power, honor. History is never just one shade. But there was also balance, a way of life tied to land, to seasons, to community. You know, my grandfather once told me something that stuck. Just because a story wasn't written in a book doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's what this part of America's story is. Not forgotten, but often untold. The forests were older than cathedrals. The rivers knew paths no road would follow. And the people, they weren't waiting to be discovered. They were already home. So, before we talk about colonies or constitutions, before we light any lantern in Boston or ring any bell in Philadelphia, we have to remember what was already here, who was already here, and what they built. Because America didn't begin in 1776. It began in footsteps, in languages now lost, in fires that burned long before we ever called it history. So tonight, before we turn the page to ships and sails and kings across the sea, let's hold this in our minds for a moment longer. This was a land full of nations, of mothers and sons, of hunters, farmers, dreamers, and the wind that rustled the grass carried their stories across centuries. Some of those stories still whisper through the trees. If you're quiet enough, you might just hear them. When the old world arrived. You ever think about what it must have felt like the first time someone stepped off a wooden ship and saw this land, not a native returning home, not someone born of this soil, but a stranger, a sailor, a soldier, a man with orders and a map written by someone who had never even seen the ocean he just crossed. It was 1492 when Columbus sailed west, not to find America, mind you. He was looking for a shortcut to Asia, spices, silk, gold, and he did find land. Just not the land he expected, not the one he told his sponsors back in Spain he'd found either. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. He never set foot on what would become the United States. That part comes a little later. Fast forward to 1607. That's the year Jamestown was founded in what's now Virginia. It was England's first permanent settlement in the New World. They came for wealth, for land, for a piece of something they didn't yet understand. And what they found? Starvation, disease, cold winters, and uneasy alliances with local Powhatan tribes. It wasn't a heroic tale, not at first. More than half of them died that first year. But they stayed. More arrived. They built forts and farms. They carved out a foothold, one muddy, fragile step at a time. A little over a decade later, in 1620, another group landed farther north. You've probably heard about them. The Pilgrims. They weren't looking for gold. They were looking for freedom, the freedom to worship in their own way. And they too faced hunger and death and fear. But they endured. With help. The Wampanoag people taught them how to plant corn, how to fish, how to live on this strange new soil. You know that story, the one about the first Thanksgiving. It's been polished over the years, but the truth underneath is still there. For a brief moment, two worlds sat at the same table. Of course, it didn't last. As more and more settlers arrived from Europe, English, Dutch, French, Spanish, the land began to change. They built fences, they drew borders, and they brought more than just crops and cattle. They brought ideas, ownership, empire, expansion. But they also brought things they didn't mean to: diseases like smallpox that swept through native populations, like fire through dry grass. Whole nations lost without a single musket fired. And then there was the other cargo, the one they don't teach loudly in school books. By the mid-1600s, the transatlantic slave trade had begun feeding its roots into the American soil. Ships carried men, women, and children from West Africa, chained, beaten, sold into a world that would never again feel like home. Slavery became part of the economic backbone of these early colonies. Tobacco in Virginia, rice in the Carolinas. Cotton would come later. That's a shadow we'll walk through in more depth soon. But for now, know this. The New World was being built on stolen land, with stolen lives. Still, the colonies grew. By 1700, there were 13 English colonies along the Atlantic coast, each with its own character. Some built on trade, others on faith. Some northern towns became tight-knit communities of craftsmen and merchants. Southern plantations grew wealthier and more dependent on enslaved labor. And yet, through it all, a strange kind of identity began to take shape. One that wasn't quite British anymore. Something in between. A feeling that maybe this place could be something new. I remember my father saying once, "Every empire thinks it owns the future until someone dares to dream outside the map." That dreaming had already begun. So the old world had arrived, with flags and cannons. But the land didn't surrender its story. It simply absorbed a new chapter. One full of ambition and contradiction, of prayers and plagues, of people searching for a better life while denying others their humanity. And still the wind blew. Still the rivers ran. Still the stars turned overhead just as they had for thousands of years. So next time you hear someone say, "America started in 1776, pause for a moment. Think about 1607. Think about 1492. Think about the millions who lived. The revolutionary experiment begins." You ever feel like something's been brewing under the surface for a while, but no one wants to say it out loud? That was the American colonies by the mid-1700s. They had governors sent from England, kings printed on coins, laws written across the ocean, but daily life, that was theirs. They farmed their own fields, made their own tools, raised their own kids. And more, they started asking, why are we paying for a crown we never see? It wasn't sudden. Revolutions never are. It started with taxes. See, after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, a global fight where British forces and American colonists battled the French and their native allies, the British Empire was broke. And guess who they figured should help pay the bill? The colonies. So came the Stamp Act of 1765. You had to pay a tax for every piece of paper you used, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. It wasn't the money that stung. It was the message, "You're subjects. You do what you're told." And Americans didn't like being told. I remember my uncle once joked, if the king wanted silence, he shouldn't have taxed printers. Because boy, did they print. Pamphlets, posters, speeches. People like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry lit sparks with words. "No taxation without representation," they cried. "If we don't have a voice in Parliament, then your laws don't belong here." The tension kept rising. Then came the Boston Massacre in 1770. British troops fired into a crowd of colonists, 5 dead. It might seem small now, but back then, it was fire on dry hay. Paul Revere made an engraving of it showing British soldiers lined up like executioners. That image, it traveled far and fast. Then came tea. The British East India Company was drowning in debt, so Parliament gave it a monopoly. Colonists had to buy their tea from one source, taxed and controlled. So in December 1773, a bunch of men in Boston dressed up like Mohawk Indians climbed aboard British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. That harbor smelled like steeped defiance for days. The British responded with what they called the coercive acts. Colonists called them the intolerable acts. Boston's port was closed. Self-government in Massachusetts was suspended. The colonies, normally squabbling like cousins at a family reunion, suddenly felt united. In 1774, they formed the First Continental Congress. 13 colonies, one table. Then, in April 1775, gunfire, Lexington and Concord. Nobody's quite sure who fired the first shot. But once it rang out, the war had begun. Militiamen faced off against redcoats. Farmers with hunting rifles, blacksmiths with muskets, preachers with powder horns. Ordinary people risking everything. I always found that moment chilling. One day you're tending your crops. The next, you're fighting an empire. And then came July 4th, 1776. You probably know that date. The Declaration of Independence signed in Philadelphia, mostly written by a lanky 33-year-old named Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Powerful words. Idealistic. Beautiful. Also, not entirely true. Because enslaved Africans weren't included. Native Americans weren't considered. Women weren't even mentioned. But the dream was planted. The war dragged on. From 1775 to 1783. Valley Forge, Saratoga, Yorktown. George Washington, who wasn't the mythical flawless hero. People make him out to be led a ragtag army through bitter winters and desperate odds. France joined in, hoping to bloody their old enemy, Britain. And slowly, painfully, the tide turned. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. The United States of America was born. But what now winning a war is one thing. Building a country. That's a whole different beast. 13 states, different interests, different economies, no king, no blueprint. They tried the Articles of Confederation, first sort of a loose friendship agreement between states. But it was too weak. No power to tax, no executive, no real unity. So in 1787, they gathered again, this time in secret in Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention, and out came a document that would shape the next 2.5 centuries. The Constitution, 3 branches, checks and balances, a system meant to prevent tyranny, even from itself. But let's not sugarcoat it. Slavery was baked in. Only white men with property could vote. The founding ideals were radical, but their reality was compromised. Still, the experiment had begun. In 1789, George Washington became the first president. He didn't want the job, took no salary at first, refused to be called Your Majesty. He just wanted to go home to Mount Vernon, farm his land, and be left alone. But duty called. And in that first peaceful transition of power, America did something new in a world used to crowns and coups. It said power comes from the people. Not all people yet. Not fairly or fully, but enough to start a story that would keep unfolding. So when you think about the American Revolution, don't just think of muskets and flags. Think of the idea behind it, that people could govern themselves. That liberty, however flawed, was worth the fight. That a nation could be built not on bloodlines, but on belief. It was messy, hypocritical, and still kind of miraculous. And that's the part I always tell my friend Jim when he says America's just another empire in decline. Maybe so. But it began as a whisper in a tavern, a shout on a battlefield, a signature on parchment. And in those early days, it dared to try something the world had never quite seen before. The growing pains of a young republic. You know how it is when a teenager suddenly gets a taste of independence. They push boundaries, stumble through decisions, figure out who they are, and sometimes make a real mess of it. That was America in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The war was won. The Constitution was inked. The new government was in place. But nobody had done this before, not like this. A nation without a king, a republic across a vast continent still being explored. It was as new as the ink drying on the Bill of Rights, and the cracks started to show early. The first big divide, North versus South. The North was building cities, factories, and banks. The South still rooted in agriculture, especially cotton. And cotton meant slaves. The Constitution hadn't settled slavery. It had, in fact, dodged it. counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, kicked the can down the road, and that road, it would get rocky. Then there was the question of expansion. Thomas Jefferson, the same guy who wrote about liberty and equality, was president in 1803 when he made the Louisiana Purchase. $15 million to double the country's size. Bought it from Napoleon, who needed cash to fund wars in Europe. It was a steal, but also a gamble, because now there was all this new land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. And with new land came new questions. Would slavery expand into it? Who actually owned it? The government, the states, the native tribes who lived there long before any deed was signed. Jefferson sent out explorers Lewis and Clark, 2 men a team and a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who guided them westward to the Pacific. It took 2 years. They mapped rivers, met tribes, recorded plants, saw mountains that scraped the sky. And they came back with one simple message. There's a whole lot more out there. Of course, that meant more pushing west, more settlers, more displacing native people. Treaties made, treaties broken. We don't like to talk about it much, but the truth is, America's growth often came at the expense of those who had no voice in Congress halls or newspaper columns. And speaking of voices, politics got loud fast. After George Washington, the nation split into factions: Federalists and Democratic Republicans, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, big government versus small government, industry versus agriculture, East Coast elites versus frontier farmers. In 1796, John Adams became the second president. Brilliant, mind-sharp tongue. But he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts laws that punished people for criticizing the government. So much for free speech. Then came Thomas Jefferson, then James Madison, then James Monroe. They tried to keep things steady, but the world wouldn't let them. In 1812, America went to war again with Britain. Yep, again. British ships had been seizing American sailors, interfering with trade. The War of 1812 was messy and inconclusive, but gave us some lasting stories, like the time the British burned down the White House, or the moment Francis Scott Key saw the flag still flying at Fort McHenry and wrote a poem that became the national anthem. By 1815, the war ended. Nobody really won, but Americans felt different, more confident, more national pride. They called it the era of good feelings. It didn't last long, because every time a new state joined the Union, the question came back: would it be free or slave? In 1820, they passed the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would be a slave state, Maine would be free, and a line was drawn literally across the map. Slavery allowed south of it, banned north of it. A band-aid on a bullet wound. Meanwhile, a new kind of leader emerged. Andrew Jackson, rough, fiery, popular with the common man. A general who'd fought the British, fought the Spanish, fought native tribes. He didn't care much for rules or refinement. When he became president in 1829, everything changed. Jackson shut down the National Bank, pushed westward expansion harder, and passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That law led to the forced relocation of native tribes, most famously the Cherokee, from their ancestral lands in the southeast to what's now Oklahoma. It was called the Trail of Tears. Thousands died on the way of hunger exposure disease, and the country kept marching west. See, for many Americans at the time, it was manifest destiny, the belief that it was their God-given right to stretch from sea to sea. But for native peoples, it was erasure. And that contradiction, expansion, and liberty, freedom, and oppression would follow America like a shadow. Still, the country was growing. New inventions, the telegraph, the steam engine, New roads, canals, railways. Factories were booming in the north, cotton booming in the south. And in all of it, one truth remained. This young republic was strong-willed, full of promise, bursting with contradictions, and heading straight for a storm. But that's a story for the next part. Westward dreams and the cost of expansion. Do you remember learning about the Oregon Trail back in school? Maybe you played that old computer game where you had to ford rivers, hunt for food, and hope nobody in your wagon party died of dysentery. Well, the real story was less pixelated and a lot messier. By the 1840s, Go West wasn't just a slogan, it was a full-blown obsession. Land meant opportunity, a new start, maybe a better life. And the United States was determined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, no matter who or what stood in the way. That dream manifest destiny had Americans packing wagons, kissing loved ones goodbye, and setting off across prairies and deserts. Entire families walked thousands of miles in sun, snow, and sickness just for a patch of land and a chance to call it theirs. But the land wasn't empty. Native tribes had lived on those plains and in those mountains for generations. And the more settlers came, the more conflict followed. Treaties were made, then broken. Entire communities were uprooted, moved, or worse. And the government. It often looked the other way, or cleared the way. Meanwhile, out west, in what was then Mexico's territory, another conflict was brewing. You ever hear someone say, "Remember the Alamo"? That was from 1836, when Texas, which was part of Mexico, tried to break away and become its own republic. A group of Americans and Tejanos Texans of Mexican descent fought Mexican forces at the Alamo Mission in San Antonio. They were outnumbered and ultimately defeated, but the story became legend brave men like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, holding out to the last. Not long after Texas declared independence. Then, in 1845, it joined the United States. Mexico wasn't too happy about that. Which brings us to the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Now, this war doesn't get as much attention as others, but it changed the map. The U.S. invaded deep into Mexican territory, eventually capturing Mexico City. When the war ended, the U.S. gained what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In one swoop, the country grew by over 500,000 square miles. Gold was discovered in California the very next year, and suddenly everybody wanted to go west. San Francisco, just a sleepy town before 1849. Then boom, the gold rush. Tens of thousands came hoping to strike it rich. Most didn't. But they stayed, built homes, opened shops, formed cities. California became a state in 1850, fast-tracked really. But again, the same question, free or slave. See, every new state reignited that old fire. The North mostly anti-slavery by now. The South still economically dependent on it. A new law, the Compromise of 1850, tried to calm the storm. California would be free, but the Fugitive Slave Act would be enforced, meaning escaped enslaved people could be captured even in free states and returned to bondage. That angered many in the North. It made slavery feel inescapable, even where it was supposedly illegal. And there was one more twist, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. That law said the people in new territories could vote whether to allow slavery. Sounds democratic, right? But it led to violence. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured in. They fought, burned towns, killed each other. It was called Bleeding Kansas. And it was in many ways a dress rehearsal for something much worse. But we're not there yet. Back on the railroads, progress was roaring ahead. The first transcontinental railroad was in the works. Factories in the north were churning out textiles, weapons, tools. The South was exporting millions of bales of cotton, thanks to enslaved labor. And cities, they were growing fast. Immigrants were arriving from Ireland, Germany, China, some escaping famine, others chasing opportunity. They brought languages, customs, tension, and they built much of the infrastructure that fueled the nation's growth. But even in progress, there was pain. Chinese immigrants helped build the western half of the railroad, faced brutal working conditions, lower pay, violent racism. Irish workers in the East didn't fare much better often, doing the hardest jobs, living in slums, dying young. And Native Americans, they kept being pushed off ancestral land, sometimes with treaties, sometimes with force. Their populations dwindled, their cultures disrupted, and yet they endured. So by the 1850s, what was America? A giant, restless adolescent, growing fast, full of promise, but deeply divided, rich in land, poor in peace, a republic fueled by hope, shadowed by injustice. And just beneath the surface, something was breaking. But I'll tell you more about that in the next part. The nation tears itself apart. You could feel it coming, like the way the air gets still before a thunderstorm. By the late 1850s, the United States wasn't just divided, it was cracking at the seams. Slavery wasn't just a policy debate anymore. It had become a moral line in the sand, and nobody could ignore it. The North had grown more industrial, more urban, and more abolitionist. The South, still rooted in agriculture, was clinging harder than ever to the system that made its wealth possible. Every newspaper, every sermon, every election, it all felt like kindling. And then came the spark. His name was Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, he was elected president without winning a single Southern state. To many in the South, that wasn't just a loss. That was a threat. Because Lincoln had made it clear he wouldn't let slavery expand into new territories. And if it couldn't grow, it might die. And if it died, so would the South's economy. Or so they feared. So one by one, Southern states started to leave. South Carolina first in December 1860, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. 7 states gone before Lincoln even took office. They formed the Confederate States of America, chose their own president, wrote their own constitution. And in April 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on a Union fort in South Carolina. That was it. The war had begun. Now, I won't lie to you, the Civil War was brutal. It lasted 4 years, killed over 600,000 people. Brother fought against brother. Towns were burned, fields destroyed, cities turned to rubble. But it was also a turning point. For the first time, the question wasn't just about preserving the Union. It was about redefining it. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't free every enslaved person immediately, only those in Confederate states. But it changed the war's meaning. It made freedom a battlefield goal. That same year, the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the bloodiest in U.S. history, turned the tide. And Lincoln's short speech afterward, just a few hundred words. But they still echo: government of the people, by the people, for the people. By 1865, the Confederacy was crumbling. Union troops marched through the South. Cities surrendered. Armies gave up. And in April, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over, but the wounds far from healed. Just 5 days later, Lincoln was shot in a theater by a Confederate sympathizer. The country had been saved, but the man who saved it wouldn't live to see the peace. And that peace wasn't peaceful. Reconstruction began the effort to rebuild the South and bring it back into the Union, and to make good on the promise of freedom. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th gave citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. The 15th gave black men the right to vote. It looked for a moment like a new America might rise from the ashes. But old habits die hard. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose up. Violence erupted, laws were twisted, rights were stripped, and by the 1870s most of the progress had been rolled back. Reconstruction ended, and in its place came Jim Crow, a system of segregation that would last for nearly a century. The South had lost the war, but the battle over its soul was far from finished. Meanwhile, the rest of the country was moving forward, or outward really. The railroad now stretched from coast to coast. Cities like Chicago and St. Louis were booming. Factories were multiplying. And immigrants from Italy, Russia, Poland, poured into cities chasing that old promise, a better life. But not everyone was invited to the party. Chinese immigrants were banned in 1882. Native tribes were forced onto reservations. And in the South, Black Americans faced violence, poverty, and second-class citizenship. So what was the United States in the years after the Civil War? Stronger on paper, weaker in spirit, united, but only just. Still, people believed, or wanted to believe, that this country could still become what it promised. And that hope, that wild, stubborn hope, is what carried it into the next chapter. But that chapter, it wasn't any easier, and we'll walk through that together in the next part. Industry immigrants and inequality. If you closed your eyes in 1880 and opened them again in 1920, you might not even recognize the place. Factories rose like forests, smokestacks filled the sky, trains cut through the land like veins, and everywhere you looked, people. So many people. This was America's Gilded Age, shiny on the outside, but cracked underneath. The name came from Mark Twain, actually. He said it looked like gold, but it was just a thin layer over cheap metal. And he wasn't wrong. Let's start with what was growing. Steel, oil, railroads. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan were building empires, not countries, actual empires, with wealth bigger than some nations. The numbers are almost hard to believe. Carnegie made so much money from steel, he gave most of it away, just to make it stop. Rockefeller controlled more oil than anyone else in the world. And Morgan, he once loaned the U.S. government money, just to keep it running. That's how powerful they were. But while they were dining on gold-rimmed china, most Americans were living a very different story. 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. In factories so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. So hot your skin blistered. So fast your fingers bled. Children worked too. 7, 8 years old in coal mines, textile mills, on the streets selling papers. No safety nets, no unions, no rights. If you got hurt, you got fired. If you complained, you got replaced. And yet, people kept coming. From Ireland, Italy, Russia, China. Waves and waves of immigrants packed into steerage ships hoping for something better. They poured into Ellis Island in New York, or Angel Island in San Francisco, eyes wide, pockets empty, dreams full. They took whatever jobs they could. They built railroads, cleaned streets, opened bakeries, started newspapers. They made America run, even when America didn't want to see them. Because not everyone welcomed the newcomers. There were whispers, then laws. Chinese immigrants were banned. Eastern Europeans were blamed for crime. Catholics were feared. Jews were attacked. And the border, always the border, was watched with nervous eyes. Still, the cities grew. Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, all swelling with workers, crowded tenements, new dialects, different smells, competing dreams. And underneath it all, the tension. Rich versus poor, native-born versus immigrant, capital versus labor. Strikes began to ripple through the country. Railway strikes, steel strikes, coal strikes, sometimes peaceful, sometimes bloody. In 1886, a rally in Chicago turned violent. A bomb exploded. Police fired. People died. The newspapers called it the Haymarket Riot. To the workers, it was a cry for help. To the bosses, it was a threat. To the politicians, it was something to be managed carefully. So they cracked down. Unions were labeled dangerous. Strikers were blacklisted. Reforms came slowly, if at all. But still, the machine kept running. By 1900, the United States was the richest industrial nation on earth. It had more railroads, more steel, more oil, more everything, but also more inequality. The richest 1% owned more than the bottom 90% combined. Sound familiar? Yet even in the shadows, change was coming. A new kind of leader was rising, the progressive. They weren't radicals. They didn't want a revolution. But they did want rules. Fairness. Some sense of balance. People like Jane Addams, who opened houses for poor immigrants. Or Ida B. Wells, who exposed the horror of lynchings. Or Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book about the meatpacking industry so disgusting that it made the president pass food safety laws. And speaking of presidents, the early 1900s brought a big one in every sense of the word. Theodore Roosevelt. He was loud, confident, a cowboy in a suit, and he wasn't afraid of the rich. He broke up monopolies, protected national parks, fought for fairness. Some called him a traitor to his class. Others called him the first modern president. And in many ways, he was. Because by the time he left office in 1909, America wasn't just a growing nation, it was a global one, with warships, ambassadors, international deals, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, it had found its footing. But of course, the world had other plans. Because while America was rising, Europe was sliding toward chaos. And soon this young, noisy, hopeful country would be pulled into a storm much bigger than itself. But that's a story for next time. The world goes to war. It started in a place most Americans had never heard of, Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. A young man pulled out a pistol and shot an archduke. The archduke was Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, and within weeks the whole continent of Europe was on fire. Alliances pulled countries in like magnets. Germany backed Austria, Russia backed Serbia, then France, then Britain. Before long, the world was at war. They called it the Great War, the war to end all wars. And at first, America stayed out. President Woodrow Wilson said the U.S. would remain neutral, and most Americans agreed. It felt far away. Foreign, not our fight. But the war didn't stay over there. German U-boats started sinking ships, including ones with Americans on board. In 1915, the Lusitania went down. Almost 200 dead. 128 of them American. That changed something. Slowly the mood shifted. Newspapers printed headlines in bold. Recruitment posters went up. And in 1917, America joined the war. It was the first time the U.S. had ever sent troops to fight in Europe. Boys from Iowa, Georgia, Ohio, barely out of high school, were suddenly in trenches in France. It was mud, blood, and machines. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks, things no one had ever seen before. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't brave, it was survival, and yet they went. Over 4 million Americans served. Some never came back. Others came back different. Meanwhile, at home, the country changed too. Women went to work in factories. Children collected scrap metal. Everyone planted victory gardens in their yards. And for the first time, the government asked Americans to buy war bonds, lending money to help the cause. Even music got involved. Over There became a national anthem. George M. Cohan's voice rang through radios and gramophones. But not everyone had the same war. Black soldiers who fought in France were heroes overseas, but came home to segregation and silence. German Americans were suddenly viewed with suspicion. Some were harassed, others arrested. Schools stopped teaching the German language, and immigrants once welcomed were now watched. Then came 1918. The war was reaching its brutal end. Germany was weakening, its allies falling, and then something worse than bullets arrived: the flu. The 1918 pandemic killed more people than the war itself. Globally, 50 million dead. In the U.S., nearly $700,000. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors begged for masks. Cities shut down. Sound familiar? But finally, in November 1918, it ended. The armistice was signed. The guns went quiet. The boys came home. Wilson sailed to Europe with a dream, a League of Nations to prevent future wars. He spoke of peace, democracy, cooperation. But Congress said no. America would not join the League, and Wilson, worn down, suffered a stroke before his term ended. At home, the country wanted something else: peace, prosperity, and to forget. The 1920s were coming: jazz, radios, fast cars. But under the music, the war left scars. Veterans with shell shock, what we now call PTSD. A growing distrust of foreigners, and a country that had tasted global power and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. But one thing was clear: America was no longer just a country on the edge of the map. It was on the world stage now, and though it might step back for a moment, the next act was already being written. Because far across the ocean, in a broken and bitter Germany, a failed artist was rising, and the world would soon go to war again. The Great Depression and the rise of FDR. You ever feel like the music just stops? That's what it felt like in 1929. The Roaring Twenties had roared, jazz had played, flappers had danced, stocks had soared. Then one October morning, it all crashed. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The stock market collapsed. One day, folks were millionaires on paper. The next, nothing. It wasn't just the rich. Banks failed. Businesses shuttered. Farms withered. People lost jobs. Homes hope. Bread lines wrapped around city blocks. Men with suits and no shoes stood waiting for a bowl of soup. Some wandered the country on freight trains looking for work. Others built shantytowns they called Hoovervilles, named bitterly after the sitting president Herbert Hoover. My granddad used to say, "We were poor, but everyone was so it didn't feel strange." Out in the Dust Bowl, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas farms turned to deserts. Winds carried away topsoil animals' futures. Kids wore masks to school. Families packed everything into jalopies and headed west, hoping California might be better. It wasn't. But through all that, America waited. And then he arrived. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He ran for president in 1932. He promised a New Deal, and folks listened. He had a wheelchair. But you didn't see that on the newsreels. What you saw was that voice, calm, strong, reassuring. "My friends," he would say, and you believed he meant it. He won in a landslide, and he got to work. He closed the banks just for a few days to stop the panic. He started the Civilian Conservation Corps, putting young men to work, planting trees, building trails, fighting fires. He built dams, roads, post offices. He hired artists to paint murals, actors to tour plays, writers to document small towns. It was government like folks had never seen. And every week on the radio, he talked to the people. Fireside chats, he called them. People sat around kitchen tables listening. My dad used to hush us and turn the knob just right, my uncle once told me. He'd say, "Quiet now, the president's talking." The country didn't magically recover, but it didn't give up either. Social Security was born a promise that old age wouldn't mean starvation. Unions grew stronger. Strikes happened. So did backlash. Some called FDR a hero. Others called him a dictator in disguise. But love him or hate him, No one ignored him. The Supreme Court tried to block some of his programs. FDR tried to add more justices. That failed. But he kept moving. And in 1936, he won again. Another landslide. He had changed what it meant to be president. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was the driver now. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was shifting. In Germany, Hitler had risen. In Italy, Mussolini marched. In Japan, the army was hungry for empire. And America still wounded. Still wary. Most folks didn't want another war. Not after the last one. But the clouds were gathering. And FDR, for all his domestic focus, could see the storm coming. By 1939, war had broken out again in Europe, and though America would stay out for a while longer. The clock was ticking. But for now, in those last years of the 1930s, the country was rebuilding itself. In diner booths and barbershops, people still talked politics, debated the New Deal, listened to swing music on the radio. Kids read Superman comics and dreamed about flight. And somewhere, a boy named Martin was growing up in Atlanta. A girl named Rosa was riding a bus in Alabama. They didn't know it yet, but their time was coming. And so was another war. World War II and the Arsenal of Democracy. It was early morning in Hawaii, a Sunday, December 7th, 1941. The sky was clear. Sailors were eating breakfast. And then the sound. Bombs, planes, fire. Pearl Harbor was under attack. Japanese bombers rained destruction on the U.S. naval base. Battleships sunk, hundreds dead, smoke curling into blue sky. By the end of the day, over 2,400 Americans had lost their lives. The next morning, President Roosevelt spoke to Congress, a date which will live in infamy. And just like that, the U.S. was in. World War II had already been raging in Europe and Asia. But now, America was fully in the fight. Hitler had invaded Poland. He'd taken France, blitzed London. And in the East, Japan had been at war with China for years. The world was burning. And America, once reluctant, became the arsenal of democracy. Factories switched from cars to tanks, from typewriters to rifles. Rosie the Riveter flexed her arm, and women poured into the workforce. My aunt still has the photo of her mom welding parts for B-17 bombers. Millions enlisted, boys from farms, cities, colleges. They crossed oceans to Europe, to Africa, to the Pacific, and the battles brutal. Normandy, D-Day, storming the beaches under a hail of gunfire. The Battle of the Bulge, snow, blood, resolve. In the Pacific, island by island, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each name a chapter in pain and sacrifice. Back home, Americans rationed sugar, gasoline, rubber. Victory gardens bloomed in backyards. Kids collected tin. Families pinned stars in their windows, gold for the fallen. There was unity, but also fear. Japanese Americans were rounded up, sent to internment camps. Citizens, children, torn from homes because of ancestry. It's a stain, and we remember it because we must. Meanwhile, scientists in secret worked in deserts and basements. The Manhattan Project, a weapon beyond imagining. By 1945, the Allies were closing in. Germany fell first. Hitler dead. Berlin in ruins. People danced in the streets. VE Day. Victory in Europe. But the Pacific War raged on. Then Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. A single bomb. Entire city gone. 3 days later, Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. The war was over. But the world changed. Over 400,000 Americans had died. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in rubble. And America stood tall, stronger, scarred, victorious. Factories had boomed. The economy surged. GIs came home to parades and to the GI Bill. It offered education, home loans, a path to middle class. Suburbs grew. Levittown popped up overnight. Televisions entered living rooms. Baseball was king. But under the surface, tension. The Soviets, once allies, were now rivals. Two superpowers, two visions for the world, and a Cold War was beginning. But for that brief moment, late 1940s America, it felt like possibility. The war was behind, the baby boom was beginning, and a young generation born in black and white newsreels was about to grow up in Technicolor. The Cold War at home and abroad. You ever walk into a room where everything looks calm, but you just know something's about to go wrong? That was America in the late 1940s and 1950s. The war was over, yes, but a new kind of battle was brewing. Not with bullets, with ideas, with threats, with shadows. The Cold War. America versus the Soviet Union. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus control. At least that's how it was framed. It wasn't a war in the traditional sense. There were no tanks rolling across Kansas. But it was everywhere in the air, in the schools, on television. Let's start at home. In 1947, President Truman laid it out with what became the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. would support countries resisting communism. Greece, Turkey, then Korea, then Vietnam. That same year, the Marshall Plan offered billions to rebuild Europe, not just out of kindness, but to keep it from falling under Soviet influence. Meanwhile, the Soviets had their own plans. In 1949, they shocked the world by detonating their first atomic bomb. That same year, China, the most populous country on Earth, turned communist. Americans were rattled, and fear turned inward. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to fame by claiming that communists had infiltrated the government. He had a list, he said, but no one ever really saw it. Still, careers were ruined. Actors, writers, teachers blacklisted. People whispered. People watched. One wrong word could wreck your life. My neighbor back in the day told me his father got investigated just for reading too many books from the library. It was a time of suspicion and silence. And beneath that paranoia, real danger. In 1950, the Korean War began. North Korea, backed by China, and the Soviets invaded the South. The U.S. jumped in under the flag of the United Nations. It was brutal. Fought in snow and mud over hills and rivers. 3 years later, a truce. No victory. Just an armistice. And thousands dead. Back home, Americans ducked under school desks during nuclear drills. Fallout shelters popped up in backyards. The idea wasn't to survive a nuclear war. It was to pretend we might. But it wasn't all fear and gloom. The 1950s also brought a kind of prosperity. Suburbs spread. Highways stretched across the country. A single-income household could buy a home, a car, and send kids to college. There were barbecues, TV dinners, Elvis Presley, and drive-in theaters. Families watched Leave It to Beaver and thought, this is the American dream. But it wasn't everyone's dream, because not everyone was invited. Segregation was still the law in many places. Black Americans were still denied jobs, housing, education. And the cracks were beginning to show. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. It was a turning point, but change came slow, and often with violence. Meanwhile, the Cold War marched on. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite. A tiny beep-beep from space, but it rang loud in American ears. If they could launch that, what else could they launch? The U.S. responded with the space race. NASA was born. Science programs exploded. Kids were told, learn math, it might help us beat the Russians. By the end of the decade, America was on edge. Nuclear arsenals were growing. Spy planes flew over enemy territory. Leaders met, smiled, and planned for war behind closed doors. And then came Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over. By 1961, he was leaning hard toward Moscow. That little island, just 90 miles from Florida, was about to become the most dangerous place on Earth. But that's a story for next time. For now, picture this dad in 1959 mowing his lawn. A mom inside pouring lemonade, kids riding bikes on freshly paved streets. Everything looks perfect. But in his pocket, he's got a pamphlet on how to build a bomb shelter. Because in this Cold War, even peace felt like pretending. Civil Rights JFK and the New American Promise. If you ask someone who lived through the early 1960s what it felt like, they might say it was a time of motion. Not just cars on highways or rockets heading to the stars, but people moving, marching, demanding something more. Because the American dream, as it was sold in black and white TV ads and Coca-Cola jingles, wasn't for everyone, and folks were tired of waiting. In 1960, a young senator named John F. Kennedy ran for president. He was handsome, articulate, and for the first time the debates were televised. People didn't just hear him, they saw him. Next to Nixon's stiff, sweaty discomfort, Kennedy looked like the future. He won barely, and when he took office in 1961, he promised a new generation of leadership. The torch has been passed, he said, to a new generation of Americans. But even as he inspired hope, the country was in turmoil. In the South, Jim Crow laws still ruled. Black Americans were still told, "No, you can't sit here. No, you can't go to that school. No, you can't vote," without jumping through hoops. But people were done asking nicely. In 1960, 4 black college students sat at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and refused to leave. It sparked a movement. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches. Young people risked beatings, jail, even death, for the right to be treated like citizens. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. His voice echoed across the mall, "I have a dream," and the world listened. But change was slow, and sometimes violent. That same year, a church in Birmingham was bombed. 4 little girls gone. Kennedy watched these events with growing concern. And while he was cautious, always balancing politics, he began to speak more boldly. In June 1963, he addressed the nation. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. He proposed civil rights legislation, but it stalled. And then, tragedy. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas, a motorcade, a rifle, a nation stunned. Kennedy was gone. I was just a kid then. But I remember the silence. Schools closed, stores quiet. We watched the funeral on TV, black and white, but it felt colorless. The torch passed again to Lyndon B. Johnson, the Texan who had been vice president. And where Kennedy had been cautious, LBJ moved fast. He pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning segregation in public places. The next year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, removing barriers to the ballot box. It was the law now. But laws don't erase hate overnight. There were riots, protests, a growing divide. Some activists felt the slow march wasn't enough. Voices like Malcolm X demanded something more urgent and less polite. And America's attention was also being pulled elsewhere, thousands of miles away. Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia. But the U.S. saw it as the next domino in the Cold War, and more American troops were being sent. By 1965, protests weren't just about civil rights. They were about war. College campuses erupted, music changed, culture shifted, and in the middle of it all, hope, grief, anger, a young generation was waking up. They didn't want their parents' world. They wanted something new, but they weren't sure what it looked like. The 1960s were a decade of contradictions, progress and pain, unity and division, a moon landing and a war on TV. But one thing was certain: America was no longer standing still. It was marching, running, falling, getting up again. And somewhere in all of that noise you could hear the country asking itself, who are we? And who do we want to be? Defeat in Vietnam, protests, and the tumultuous 70s. By the late 1960s, it felt like America was shouting at itself. The Vietnam War was no longer a distant conflict in a faraway jungle. It was in the newspapers on the evening news, in the faces of draft-age sons, and in the chants echoing through city streets. It started with advisors, a few here, a few there. But by 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Young men, barely 20, were trudging through rice paddies, unsure why they were there, or when they'd come home. Many didn't. The fighting was brutal. The enemy wasn't always visible. The jungle swallowed everything. And back home, the country was unraveling. Protests exploded. On college campuses, in Washington, at draft offices. People burned draft cards, chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" I remember watching those marches on TV with my uncle. He had fought in World War II. He couldn't understand the anger. But my cousin, he was just hoping his lottery number wouldn't come up. And then, 1968. It felt like the year the world cracked open. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Cities erupted in grief and flames. 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, and a leading voice for change, was gunned down after winning the California primary. It was like hope itself had been shot. That summer, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned into chaos. Police clashed with protesters. The world was watching, and it wasn't proud. Lyndon Johnson, worn down by war and division, chose not to run again. And in the fall, a familiar name returned: Richard Nixon. He promised law and order. He said he had a secret plan to end the war. America, exhausted, listened. He won. But the war dragged on. Nixon escalated the bombing, expanded the war into Cambodia. More protests, more coffins coming home. And in 1970, at Kent State University, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters. 4 dead. Students, kids. A photograph from that day, a girl kneeling over a body screaming, burned itself into the American psyche. By 1973, the U.S. began to withdraw troops. 2 years later, Saigon fell. America had lost. Not just the war, but something more. Innocence, unity, belief in government. And speaking of government, in 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. At first it seemed small, a political dirty trick. But 2 reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, followed the trail. It led all the way to the Oval Office. Tapes, cover-ups, lies. By 1974, Nixon resigned, the only president ever to do so. He waved from the helicopter, and just like that, he was gone. Gerald Ford stepped in. He told us, "Our long national nightmare is over, but trust that takes longer to rebuild." Meanwhile, the economy was sputtering. Gas lines stretched for blocks. OPEC had cut oil supplies. Prices soared. For the first time, Americans had to think twice about filling their tanks. Inflation rose. Unemployment ticked up. It was the birth of a term no one had used before: stagflation. And through it all, music changed. Fashion got wild. People danced their stress out at discotheques. But underneath the disco balls and bell-bottoms, the country was trying to catch its breath, trying to figure out what came next. Because the 1970s weren't just about endings, they were about transitions. The civil rights movement had opened doors, but inequality still lingered. Women were demanding more, not just jobs, but respect. And technology was creeping in: computers, microwaves, cable TV. The world was changing, faster than people knew how to process. And yet even in all the noise, the protests, the resignations, the disco America kept going. Wounded, wiser, but still walking forward. Because that's what this country does. It stumbles, it argues, it even breaks sometimes. But it keeps walking. Reagan recovery and the conservative wave. When 1980 arrived, America was tired. Tired of inflation, tired of gas lines, tired of hostages in Iran, tired of feeling smaller than it used to be. Enter Ronald Reagan, an actor turned governor, turned presidential candidate. He smiled, told stories, and asked the country a question that stuck. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? For many Americans, the answer was no. So they handed Reagan the keys. And on January 20th, 1981, as he stood on the Capitol steps being sworn in, something else happened across the globe. The hostages in Iran were released after 444 days. Some called it coincidence, others called it timing. Either way, Reagan started his presidency with a surge of confidence. He promised smaller government, lower taxes, a strong military, and a return to American greatness. He called it Morning in America, a new dawn. And to millions it felt like that. Reagan cut taxes, dramatically. He believed that giving businesses and individuals more money would spark growth. They called it trickle-down economics. Supporters said it worked. The stock market climbed, inflation, dropped jobs, returned. Critics pointed out the growing national debt and widening gap between rich and poor. But if the 1970s felt like a hangover, the 1980s felt like caffeine and neon. There were new gadgets, VCRs, personal computers, Walkmans. Kids played Pac-Man. Adults bought microwave dinners. And Wall Street boomed. Greed is good, said Gordon Gekko, a movie character, sure, but also kind of the decade's unofficial mascot. Meanwhile, Reagan ramped up the Cold War. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire, poured billions into defense, including a missile defense idea called Star Wars. And yet behind the bluster diplomacy brewed. In 1985, a new Soviet leader appeared, Mikhail Gorbachev. Younger, smarter, willing to talk. The two men met in Geneva, in Reykjavik, in Washington. They didn't always agree, but the ice began to melt. And by Reagan's second term, the Cold War was thawing. Back home, another crisis had emerged: AIDS. First dismissed as a disease of others, it quickly spread, devastated communities, and revealed deep cracks in the healthcare system and in public compassion. It took years too many for Washington to respond. But on the ground, activists, doctors, and everyday heroes stepped in. There were victories, too. In 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. In 1987, Black Monday hit, the stock market crashed. But recovery came faster than feared. And on a cold day in Berlin, Reagan stood before a wall that had split a city in two since 1961 and said 7 famous words: Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was a challenge, a dare, a line in history. By 1989, just months after Reagan left office, the Berlin Wall would fall. People climbed it, danced on it, chipped away pieces to keep as souvenirs. The Cold War, it seemed, was ending, not with a bang, but with a celebration. And America, it was riding high again. Reagan left office with high approval ratings. To some, he was a hero who restored pride. To others, a man whose policies left too many behind. But no one doubted he changed the tone, from malaise to Morning in America, from doubt to declaration. The 1980s weren't quiet. They were bold, brash, bright. Shoulder pads, synthesizers, and Wall Street all at once. But underneath it all, the country was shifting again. New voices were rising, new battles looming, and a new generation, the children of boomers, was growing up watching it all unfold in living color. Because history doesn't pause. Not for disco, not for stock crashes, not even for Ronald Reagan's farewell wave from Marine One. The 1990s peace, prosperity, and the digital dawn. If the 1980s were loud, the 1990s were laser-focused, focused on the future, focused on growth, focused on figuring out what a post-Cold War world was supposed to look like. In 1991, it finally happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. 70 years of communism gone. No missiles, no invasion, just paperwork, flags lowered, borders redrawn. It was surreal. America stood as the world's lone superpower. The Cold War was over. History, at least for a moment, felt like it had turned a page. And just like that, the 1990s became a decade of breath-catching, of booming markets, of new toys and new tunes. In came a Southern governor with a saxophone and a slogan. "It's the economy, stupid." Bill Clinton, young charismatic from Hope, Arkansas. He connected with voters in a way few had, and in 1992, he won the presidency. The economy surged. Tech stocks exploded. People bought their first home computers with giant monitors and whirring disk drives. They dialed into the internet. Slowly. You remember that sound, the screech and hum of a dial-up modem connecting. AOL, email, chat rooms. It felt like magic. And for once, war wasn't dominating the headlines. Yes, there were moments, Desert Storm in the Gulf, US soldiers in Somalia, NATO in the Balkans. But it wasn't Vietnam. It wasn't World War II. Most Americans were focused inward. The economy was hot. Unemployment dropped. Gas was cheap. TVs got bigger. CDs replaced cassettes. There was a vibe like we were preparing for something big, a new millennium. Culturally, the 90s were loud in their own way. MTV still played music videos. Friends and Seinfeld ruled Thursday nights. Michael Jordan ruled everything else. Kids grew up with Tamagotchi's Game Boys and the first PlayStation. The O.J. Simpson trial stopped the country in its tracks. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone watched. And in 1998, the president himself became the story. A scandal, a White House intern, a blue dress and late-night headlines. Bill Clinton was impeached by the House, but not removed by the Senate. It was messy, polarizing, and yet, life went on. The economy kept growing. People got cell phones the size of bricks, and dot-com startups promised to change everything. Then came Y2K, the fear that all computers would crash at midnight on New Year's Eve 1999. People stocked up on bottled water. Bank balances were double-checked, and when the clock struck midnight, nothing happened. Well, except fireworks and champagne. But here's the thing. The 1990s, for all their peace and optimism, were also quietly building pressure. The internet was still the Wild West. Globalization was reshaping jobs, and in caves halfway across the world, extremists were plotting. No one knew that on a clear Tuesday morning just a year later, everything would change. But in that final breath of the 20th century, America danced, prospered, logged on, and looked ahead. September 11th, and a new American century. It was a perfect Tuesday morning, clear skies, cool air. One of those days in early September where summer lingers, but the scent of autumn is already there if you breathe deep. People were dropping off kids at school, making coffee, commuting, flipping on the news. And then, at 8:46 a.m., everything cracked. A plane. The North Tower of the World Trade Center. Smoke, fire, confusion. At first, we didn't know what we were looking at. Was it an accident? A horrible mistake. But 17 minutes later, another plane hit the South Tower, and the illusion shattered. This wasn't an accident. Then came the Pentagon. Then Flight 93, where passengers fought back, bringing the plane down in a Pennsylvania field. By 10:30 a.m., both towers had collapsed. The skyline was gone. Lower Manhattan was dust and grief, and America was changed. I remember the silence. No planes in the sky, no laughter in the streets, just flags suddenly everywhere, and candles flickering on suburban porches. We cried, we prayed. We looked at each other differently, maybe with more compassion, or maybe with more fear. And we asked, why in the days that followed, a name emerged. Osama bin Laden, leader of Al-Qaeda, a terrorist network that had already attacked American targets overseas. This time, they had struck at home. President George W. Bush, just months into his presidency, addressed the nation with solemn resolve. And within weeks, American forces were in Afghanistan, hunting Al-Qaeda and toppling the Taliban regime that had harbored them. It was the start of the global war on terror. New security laws were passed. Airports changed overnight. A new agency was born, the Department of Homeland Security. We were told to stay vigilant, to report anything suspicious. Patriotism surged. So did anxiety. Then, in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. The justification that Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, was hiding weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons were never found. But the war lasted and lasted. American soldiers deployed again and again. Civilians watched the news. Some protested. Others tied yellow ribbons around trees. At home, we lived with a new sense of vulnerability. Anthrax in the mail, color-coded threat levels on the news, and yet life kept moving. iPods arrived. Facebook launched in college dorms. Smartphones began to shrink the world to our fingertips. We watched reality shows, voted on singing competitions, and in 2008, something happened that felt almost impossible. America elected its first black president, Barack Obama, a senator from Illinois, a former community organizer, hope and change. Some cried on election night, not just out of joy, but because they had never believed they'd live to see it. For many, it felt like a new chapter, a symbol of how far the country had come. But others felt uneasy. Divisions ran deep, racial, political, cultural. The economy had crashed in 2008. Wall Street imploded, banks failed, families lost homes, retirement accounts vanished. The Great Recession hit hard. Obama's first years were consumed with recovery efforts, stimulus packages, bailouts, and a massive healthcare overhaul, the Affordable Care Act. Some saw it as progress. Others saw it as government overreach. Cable news got louder. Social media got meaner. Everyone had a platform, and every disagreement became a shouting match. Still, America pushed forward. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011 in a raid ordered by Obama. A symbolic closure, but the wars dragged on. New threats emerged: ISIS, cyber attacks, and at home, mass shootings became heartbreakingly frequent. But we kept going. We cheered at Olympic gold medals. We mourned celebrities who had shaped our lives. We binge-watched shows that connected us across time zones. And always beneath the noise there was that lingering question: what does it mean to be American now? The 21st century had begun with fire and ash. And now in the 2010s, it was being rewritten in code, in conflict, and in conversation. The 2010s, technology tensions and a nation redefined. You remember the 2010s? It was a decade that started with hashtags and ended with reckonings. Smartphones became more than just phones. They became maps, cameras, diaries, alarm clocks, lifelines, and sometimes echo chambers. We used to say there's an app for that, like it was magic. Now we expect an app for everything. And with that came social media, not just for fun anymore, but as a force. A platform for movements, a battlefield for ideas, a place where you could be heard or completely torn apart. In 2013, a name started trending that would change everything Black Lives Matter. It began after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who had fatally shot Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager, in Florida. More names followed: Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice. Hashtags turned into marches. Protests filled the streets. People said it wasn't new, just newly recorded. Smartphones had become witnesses, and America was being forced to watch itself. Meanwhile, the political climate heated up. Barack Obama won a second term in 2012, but the divide between parties was growing. Gridlock in Congress became the norm. The term fake news hadn't entered the dictionary yet, but trust in institutions was slipping. Then came 2016, and everything tilted. Donald Trump, a real estate mogul and reality TV star, ran for president and won. It was a campaign unlike any before it. Blunt, combative, unfiltered. Some Americans cheered, believing he would shake up a broken system. Others were stunned, fearing what his presidency would mean. Almost overnight, every conversation felt political. Family dinners, Facebook posts, even football games. In 2017, a new movement erupted: Me Too. Women and men began sharing their stories of sexual harassment and abuse. The world watched as powerful figures in Hollywood, media, politics, and beyond were called out. It wasn't just about headlines. It was about voices, about pain that had been whispered for too long, finally spoken out loud. At the same time, America was grappling with who it wanted to be. Debates over immigration, over guns, over the environment, over what truth even meant in an age of deep fakes and disinformation. Tech giants, Facebook, Twitter, Google, were no longer seen as playful startups. They were empires shaping elections and opinions, whether they meant to or not. And yet, amid all this, people kept going. We found joy in memes. We watched royal weddings and viral dances. We mourned together when Notre Dame burned. We cheered when the U.S. women's soccer team brought home another World Cup. Then, as the decade closed, something stirred on the other side of the world: a virus. First reports came out of Wuhan, China, a strange pneumonia spreading fast. Few paid attention, but that would change. The 2020s, pandemic protest, and a nation at the crossroads. It started like any other year. January 2020, new calendars, fresh resolutions. Nobody knew that normal was about to break. By March, it was clear the world was changing. COVID-19 wasn't just a news story anymore. It was here. Invisible, contagious, relentless. Schools closed, offices shut down, flights were grounded, streets fell silent. We stayed home, wiped down groceries, searched for toilet paper, watched numbers climb, cases, deaths fear. And we waited for answers, for vaccines, for life to go back. Masks became part of our outfits. Zoom became a verb. Social distancing became a rule. And everything that felt solid, routines, rituals, even hugs, turned strange. But while the world paused, America boiled. On May 25, 2020, a name echoed across the globe: George Floyd. A man, pinned to the ground, a knee on his neck, a cry, "I can't breathe," and the world saw. Not just saw, felt. It wasn't just about one man. It was about years, decades, centuries, about systems and silence, about rage and reckoning. Protests erupted, not just in Minneapolis, but everywhere. People flooded the streets wearing masks, holding signs demanding change. Some called it a second civil rights movement. Others called it chaos. But either way, America was awake, raw, restless, reckoning with itself. All of this, while a pandemic raged on. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors and nurses became heroes, exhausted, overworked, underprotected. We clapped from balconies, hung signs in windows, and mourned, so many mourned, without even being able to say goodbye in person. In November 2020, the country held its breath again. An election like no other. Mail-in ballots, misinformation, tensions. And in the end, Joe Biden elected as the 46th president, with Kamala Harris making history as the first woman and woman of color to become vice president. But the transition wasn't smooth. On January 6, 2021, something unimaginable happened. A mob waving flags, shouting slogans stormed the U.S. Capitol. Windows smashed, offices ransacked, lawmakers evacuated. It was chaotic, violent, shocking, and for many, heartbreaking. The cradle of American democracy breached by its own citizens. The country was shaken, and still, it kept going. Vaccines rolled out. Gradually life reopened. Restaurants filled. Schools resumed. But things didn't feel the same. Trust had frayed. Politics were bitter. Conversations careful guarded, sometimes avoided altogether. Climate disasters came harder. Wildfires, floods, hurricanes. We debated everything from masks to history books. And social media, once a tool, now often felt like a trap. But in small ways, hope returned. We learned to gather again carefully, to grieve properly, to rebuild not just homes or businesses, but connections, and to remember that history isn't something you just read about. Sometimes you live it. You and I, we've lived through a lot, and somehow we're still here, still trying, still asking, still becoming. Epilogue. Listening to the past, dreaming forward. So there you have it. From the first footsteps on this land to revolutions and reckonings. From slavery and civil war to protest songs and silent prayers. From factories to firewalls. From telegraphs to TikTok. It's been a journey long, messy, and impossibly human. History, after all, isn't a straight line. It loops. It stumbles. It forgets, remembers, repeats. It is not just about presidents and wars. It's about porch talks and pay stubs, about recipes passed down and names carved into tree trunks, about your grandpa's stories and your mother's sacrifices. And yes, it's about you. Because every choice you make, every truth you carry, every kindness you offer, joins the story. America has never been finished. It's always becoming. Shaped not just by the powerful, but by people like you and me, sitting here, listening, wondering, hoping. So maybe tonight, as you drift to sleep, you'll carry one piece of that story with you, not as a burden, but as a reminder that the past is not just behind us, it's beside us, beneath us, and if we're quiet enough, we can still hear it breathing. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Sleep well, my friend. Tomorrow is history too.